Now, in today's press, the Times has called them our rivers of shame, our filthy, polluted rivers where untreated sewage, and I have to say all the other disgusting things that go with it, is regularly dumped with little or no sanction. And it's not too hard to find where the blame lies, because it lies with our water companies. The latest culprit, as the Times reported this week, is Thames Water, whose Mogden sewage treatment works in West London, which is supposed to process the waste of 2 million people. But in an emergency resulting from heavy rain, in order to stop our ancient sewage system backing up, the company allowed raw effluent to be released into the Thames in staggering quantities. Now, this is all supposed to be monitored. And yet, in February last year, or this year, I beg your pardon, a spillage was large enough to fill 240 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The Mogden monitors recorded no release whatsoever. And so no warnings were issued. So if we got that right, the people swimming, paddleboarding or canoeing down the river, we're hoping none of them suffered any consequences, but you shudder to think about the impact it had on the fish and the wildlife. 240 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of sewage just released out into the wild. But of course, Thames Water aren't alone. 9 English water companies owned up last year to discharging raw sewage on more than 200,000 occasions. And it's no wonder that they continue to do so, because the fines are so low. In 2017, Thames Water was fined £20 million for its illegal release of 1.9 billion litres of untreated sewage into the Thames. £20 million. Some of you might think that that's a lot, but it's not exactly crippling for a company that posted an operational profit of over £500 million in the last financial year. Now, Thames Water say, in February, the manual process of information transfer within Thames Water didn't happen. This was unintentional. It said it planned digital updates to Mogden, the sewage plant, to remove this potential source of human error. It also said there was a fault with either the sensor or the internal processing prevented them from registering that the water level was above the threshold level and hence spilling. Other equipment nonetheless recorded an estimate of the volume involved, so there was no attempt or intention to mislead or hide the fact. So what's to be done? And what will the government get on and do and make sure that it is done? Well, joining me now are Professor Peter Hammond, previously a senior research fellow at Oxford University and their Big Data Institute, and now a member from the campaign group Windrush Against Sewage Pollution. Feargal Sharkey joins me, the former Undertone singer and Rivers campaigner, and Conservative MP Philip Dunne, who chairs the Environmental Audit Committee, who's bringing in a private members' bill to try and stop pollution. Feargal, I'd like to start with you. You've been campaigning now for quite some time about the pollution in our rivers. When was it first brought to your attention? When did you personally start noticing the huge problem that we have?
I began to really notice something about 3 years ago, and something through my hobby, I have a huge passion for fly fishing. Invariably, that means standing about in the middle of rivers, waving bits of carbon fibre around my head. And when you're that close up and personal with a river, you notice and get very sensitive to any shift or change. And I began to notice that there was a pattern of decline. The rivers didn't look as healthy. The plant life was dying off. The insect life was dying off. Rivers began to smell. And as you've just highlighted, we now know that last year water companies spent over 1.5 million hours dumping sewage into England's rivers. And if I could pull up one last little thought for your listeners, the UK government was actually taken to court by the European Court of Justice 8 years ago and found non-compliant in breach of the law and were told to stop it. And in fact, they were told it should only ever happen in exceptional circumstances. And as you've already pointed out, Thames Water alone, something like 37 million tonnes of sewage a year into the River Thames. Can someone please explain to me what is the exceptional circumstances that allow you to do that kind of thing? unhindered.
We'll definitely get on to looking at that. I just wanted to ask the Professor Peter Hammond. I think a lot of people, and on this show, we've made it a bit of a campaign issue that we want to follow and highlight, because not enough people, I think, are talking about it. But one of my concerns has always been that for people who don't live anywhere near a river, for people who don't live in the countryside, or like Feargal, like fly fishing, or have any association with rivers or coasts, as we heard from one of our previous guests who was part of the Surfers Against Sewage, can you explain to us what the knock-on effect is if we have all that raw sewage from water companies being dumped into the rivers? What is the knock-on effect to someone who lives in a flat in an urban environment who goes nowhere near a river?
Well, they don't need to go to be living in the countryside. For example, if you live in Roehampton Vale, which is very close to Richmond Park, there's a CSO there that discharged raw sewage for 6,000 hours, which Thames Water recorded as 270 separate spills. But actually, when you look at the data, as I have done, it's actually one spill of 269 days without any break. And that CSO spills sewage into the Beverley Brook. Now, the Beverley Brook flows through Richmond Park. So if you're walking through Richmond Park, you should be keeping an eye on the Beverley Brook, because you may see this raw sewage flowing down the Beverley Brook on its way to Putney, where it joins the River Thames.
Now, you part of the campaign group Windrush Against Sewage Pollution. I think quite a lot of people, only because Windrush, of course, has taken on to mean a different news item. Can you explain to us about Windrush, the river, and the sewage problem that you're having at the moment?
So I'm very lucky in that the River Windrush flows through my garden, and I've been able to observe it for 18 years, and I've seen the deterioration of the river. In 2009, 2010, we would have lots of swans on the river. We would have the beautiful ranunculus, the green wavy fronds with the little white flowers. And gradually over the years, we've seen fewer fish, less of the ranunculus. Because we've got fewer fish, we don't get the otters that I used to film in my garden. And we don't get the mayfly that come out of the river in May, which is the clue for the fly fishermen to get out there and start fishing. So we've seen a major deterioration of the river, and that was brought to my attention by a neighbour, Ash Smith, who started the WASP campaign, the Windrush Against Sewage Pollution. And being a mathematician by training, my instinct was to check what was happening at the local sewage treatment works. And we were horrified, like many people still are, to find out that the raw sewage is discharged into the river without any treatment. And so I've delved deeply into what these different sewage treatment works do, and I've been able to detect unpermitted, illegal spills and reported them to the agency and to Ofwat.
I want to move on to Philip Dunne, who joins us, Conservative MP, who also chairs the Environmental Audit Committee. And Philip, we've spoken before on this issue. You're also bringing the Private Members Bill to try and stop the pollution. I think to many people who are new to the story, they are shocked to find, firstly, the amounts we're talking about, and also the fact that water companies are allowed to actually flush out those huge amounts into our rivers of untreated sewage. Can you explain to us why water companies are allowed to do that?
Sure. Well, first of all, Alexis, I'm really pleased that you're picking this up with such alacrity at the moment, and I'm really delighted you've got both Feargal and Peter on today, because they're both really powerful advocates to try and do something about this. I mean, the real problem comes from the fact that we've got a drainage and sewerage system in this country which was originally built in the Victorian era, and we have not kept pace with investing in our treatment of human sewage with the population growth and development across the country. So at heart, that's the root of the problem. What the Environment Agency is tasked to do is to monitor and to regulate spills, and they have allowed water companies to have a release valve, which, as you said earlier in your introduction, was designed to be for exceptional occasions when there's been significant rainfall. And of course, with increasing climate change and increasing intensity of rainfall, this is happening effectively routinely. And because the water companies have not been put under the pressure to invest in providing capacity to cope with this increased volumes of water, they are allowed effectively by the Environment Agency their license to spill. And that's what my bill is trying to stop, so that we get on top of this issue and start to address, frankly, decades of underinvestment in dealing with the effluent that we as human beings are creating.
So with your bill stopping them from having that license to spill, what are they going to do instead of that? Because it seems to me that they don't have the capacity, if, for example, we have heavy rain, to do anything else than spill.
Well, that's right. We can't have sewage backing up into through our toilet bowls into our properties or across farmland and other areas into our streets. So this is going to take a long time to fix. But there are lots of measures in my bill to start trying to address this. And the first thing, picking up on what was been said earlier, is shining the spotlight of transparency on what's going on. I think if the public, just as Peter was talking about going for a walk through Richmond Park, if you knew that your dog was jumping across into the Beverley Brook chasing a stick and coming out covered in human sewage, you wouldn't throw the stick in the brook. There's too much it's too difficult to get access to information about what's really going on within the sewage system in this country. So my bill starts by trying to shine a spotlight of transparency so that we get proper data published in regularly, and as technology evolves, allowing us to get real-time collection, not just of the frequency of spills, which doesn't really tell us very much, but about what the impact of that is on the water quality of the rivers into which these treatment plants are discharging.
Feargal, you mentioned that this isn't a new thing. In fact, the UK has been brought to answer by the European institutions monitoring levels of pollution for quite some time. Why do you think we are still where we're at? Do you think the government have not taken this issue seriously? Although we know that Philip is trying to get and do everything he can, trying to get this private members bill through, but we all know how difficult private members bills are to get through and to get them into statutory law. Why do you think we are where we are at the moment? Is it lack of funding? Is it because we've cut down the amount of money that we spend in monitoring these companies? Or is it an attitude that perhaps this government and successive governments just don't care enough?
I think just to add to what Peter says, and by the way, my applause to Philip rather for his bill and the initiative. There clearly has been a failure in political leadership, and that goes back decades. As Philip has highlighted, there's been a chronic underinvestment. To give your listeners a little context, water companies have paid out over £57 billion in dividends over the last 30 years. I clearly would argue that there was enough money around that we could have been making larger investment than we have. And ultimately, you couple all of that, lack of leadership, lack of investment, and a complete failure of regulation. And I think, as Philip has highlighted, the board and senior management of the Environment Agency need to be held to account, because ultimately they are the ones that are actually allowing all of this to happen. And they, in my personal opinion, have failed in their obligation to protect these rivers from that kind of abuse.
Philip, is it a combination of paying out big fat dividends to shareholders, plus successive governments not being strict enough? I mean, it seems to me that this isn't. We're not been talking about the environment. It's not a recent thing. This is as Feargal's been saying. This is decades of this problem being there. The money is there. Certainly the companies have the money to repair the Victorian sewage plants, but they choose not to spend it in repairing what needs to be done, but instead they want to reward their shareholders.
Well, it's partly because of the objectives which they're set through the regulators, and it's not just the Environment Agency, it's also Ofwat that regulates the prices that they can charge to consumers, which sets the amount of capital expenditure they're effectively able to invest in the system. Now, the priority through the 5-yearly pricing reviews that we've had for the last 20 years or so has been to reduce leakage and to focus on water supply, which they're also responsible for, so that we've all got drinking water that we can use, which is a very important function that they have. And it has not been focused on what's happening at the other end of the process in dealing with wastewater. So, for example, in the current WINEP, it's called, which is the 5-yearly capex that is approved by the regulators to spend on water quality and wastewater. The water companies collectively are allowed to spend £5 billion over 5 years, so that's £1 billion a year. And as Feargal has just said, that is woefully inadequate in trying to address the problems that we've got. So one of the things that I'm trying to encourage through my bill is to allow Ofwat, the regulator, in its next 5-yearly review, to have its objectives looked at so that it can say, well, it's not only water supply that we need to be focusing water companies' attention on, it's also water quality. So I've got an amendment into the Environment Bill, which is coming back to the Commons next week, and my bill also tries to address this issue as well, so that the water companies are actively encouraged to invest in in sorting out water quality issues.
Professor Hammond, as someone who's had, you've got the Windrush River running down the bottom of your garden. Can you describe to us the changes that you've seen? I mean, you started off by describing you saw the lack of the fish numbers going down, which of course affected the otter numbers that you would see. But what actually happens to the water? What can you see physically changing in the water?
Well, in 2009-10, the river would have looked relatively clear. You would have been able to see the bottom. You would have seen here and there some gravel, sort of orange-coloured gravel, which a lot of the trout and other fish spawn on. Now you cannot see the bottom. The river is a kind of grey, turbid colour, and it's like that from here down to where it reaches the Thames, and it gets worse as you get further down the Thames.
And what happens to not just what's in the river, but what happens to things that are, the vegetation and the plants that are on the river banks? Are they affected as well?
Well, of course. For instance, at the Whitney sewage treatment works, over the winter this year, they were spilling sewage uncontrolled for months, and they had a very serious attack of what's called sewage fungus. So this is rather like a gross outer space amoebic structure in the river, and that coats all the plants, so the plants can't grow, and that means that fish don't have things to eat, invertebrates can't lay their eggs, and then the other animals, the birds that eat the invertebrates, don't have food. So the whole food chain is affected.
Now, when you report these spillages, and as you said, you've been witness to them, sometimes they go unreported, as I began my piece by saying that the Thames water spillage went unreported, and certainly people were not warned that this massive dump of raw sewage had happened in the River Thames. When you go to the authorities and you report it, what happens? How are you treated? How are you dealt with?
Not with a great deal of respect sometimes, to be honest. And in some face-to-face meetings, for instance, with the Environment Agency staff, they've said that they're not competent to check all of the data. I've occasionally tried to take them through data, and they struggle to understand. Maybe that's my ability to explain. But even Ofwat, for example, we have a quote from them saying that they don't check the figures themselves, but they ask the companies to assure them that the data is accurate. So basically, they leave it to the companies and trust the companies to provide complete and accurate data. And what we've shown is that the data is not complete and it's not always accurate.
Feargal, do we think Ofwat is fit for purpose, or are they unable to do their job due to underfunding, or do they need a complete restructuring? What's your view?
Oh, no, anything that's happening that's going on that level, in my personal opinion, is just due to simple incompetence. I agree completely with Philip. Ofwat and the Environment Agency both need to be held to account. As Philip has illustrated, there is a apparent £1 billion a year being spent in the environment. In the big scheme of things, that's actually a paltry sum of money. And I might suggest that some people may want to scrutinise the exact detail of that £1 billion, because I think you might find it's not necessarily been spent on what you might think it to. I think for me, the real opportunity we have right now, in a couple of days' time, government will reintroduce its new environment bill back into Parliament. It needs to be approved by the end of the year. Government, I would suggest, might act properly by simply taking and adopting Philip's private member's bill and attaching it as an amendment to the environment bill and passing it before Christmas.
Philip,
great idea, Feargal.
great support by all my guests and also previous guests. Now, we know the private members' bills are very difficult to get through to the statutes books. What are the chances of your bill? Have you got cross-party support? Have you got enough members of your own party willing to step forward and support it?
Well, you're quite right. They are very difficult to get through, and this is quite a complicated one. It's got a lot of measures in it, but I have got a lot of support for it already. I've been in touch with MPs. In fact, I've written to all MPs in England and Wales during the course of this recess this week, and I've currently got 58 MPs, including me, signed up to support it. And we'll have to see. I need to get 100 for the second reading debate on Friday, the 13th of November. I'm very much hoping that whatever's going to be announced later by the Prime Minister is not going to stop Parliament from returning and functioning properly. So I'll be leading the debate on the 13th of November and very much hope that I'll get colleagues to support it. One thing that I have done is I provided them with the breakdown of data, which Peter's been very heavily involved with, but also the Rivers Trust, in breaking down by constituency the number of spillages from CSOs and the duration of those spillages. So every MP has got that information, every MP in England, and next week the Welsh MPs will get it. I don't have the data for Scotland and Northern Ireland, which is a degree of. It's quite shocking to a number of them. In my own constituency, for example, which Peter's been helping me with, we've had 72 instances admitted by the water company in 2019 with spillages for over 7,700 hours during the course of last year. And I've given similar information to everybody, and I would encourage your listeners to get onto their MP if they're concerned about this issue and encourage them to turn up on the 13th of November and support the bill.
And just out of curiosity, Philip, the people that you've approached, you say you've got 58, hoping to make it up to 100. I mean, it might sound like a very naive question, but why would people not be supporting your bill?
That's a good question. I think, why people support private members' bills is kind of different. Everybody knows they're hard to get through. Getting government support is critical, and I think the government will have to make their mind up, but I think it's relatively unlikely that they will want to support this bill at this stage in this form. I think they're very supportive of the objectives of trying to improve water quality, and we've seen that with the targets, the document they published in mid-August about setting targets for water quality, which I really welcome. And they've introduced into the Environment Bill the new concept of 5-yearly management plans for drainage and water management by the water companies, and I'm trying to make a simple amendment to that bill, which will take into account water quality, which I very much hope the government will accept.
Okay.
So we'll have to see what happens on the 13th.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you so much for giving me your time. Professor Peter Hammond, previously a senior research fellow at Oxford University and a member of the campaign group Windrush Against Sewage Pollution. Feargal, Sharkey, formerly the singer of the Undertones and Rivers campaigner. And you just heard there from Conservative MP Philip Dunne, who chairs the Environmental Audit Committee, who's bringing up his private member's bill to try and stop pollution. So write to your MP is the advice from Philip Dunne, and make sure that they're going to be in Parliament and able to vote for his private member's bill on the 13th of November. Of course, that's all being allowable if Parliament continues to sit through the oncoming lockdown.